Good morning. As Ashlyn said, my name's Emily Moss Wilson, and a lot of people know me as E-Moss here at the festival. It helps distinguish the Emilys, and also it's my Cher Madonna name, so if you could just please indulge it while you're here. But yeah, we're here for a fascinating panel. We're gonna be talking about all things world building with some talented creators. So you don't really wanna hear about me, so let me go ahead and bring them up. First of all, we have Chris Eyre, director of the show you guys saw last night, Dark Winds. And then we have a very talented production designer, LePere Schloop, who is a production designer for the upcoming Interview with the Vampire series. And last but certainly not least, Silas Howard, director of all things, but today we'll be talking a lot about his work on Dickinson.
You got the couch. He has the couch. How is the couch?
I feel like we're so in a line. Here, hold on. Can you angle a little bit?
You're seeing wonderful design
There you go.
as it's happening.
That's right. So speaking of production design and set design, sometimes you have to move things to make it work. Well, yeah, this is a really fun conversation because you guys are in the foxhole, your sleeves rolled up, they're every day on set helping to collaborate and create the stuff that we get to see. A lot of hard work and stuff that a lot of us don't know about. And so this is a little bit of a peek behind the curtain, but also just kind of talking about things that inspire you guys as artists. Obviously, these shows, just very briefly, if you could, let's talk about, and we can just start with you, Silas, specifically where your show is set and maybe a specific challenge with that particular time period that you found in the work.
So, sorry, I'm sweaty. It's very
Hello?
There you go. Oh, I gotta talk in this. I'm very sweaty from just going 2 blocks.
Well, welcome to Austin.
So, pardon me. So the show that I worked on for 3 seasons and all of the 3rd season is about Emily Dickinson, called Dickinson, and it's set in the 1800s, mid 1800s. And last season was during the Civil War. And yes, there's a lot of, there's things that came up, we had an episode where a young suitor was saying, let's jump in the lake. So he went, you would have him take his pants down, he'd have boxers, but underwear hadn't been invented yet. So we had to quickly invent some underwear for him to have so that he could jump into the water. But yeah, just all of the details of the world really are just, it's kind of an amazing thing to go and the opera episode too, they didn't have electricity, so the lights don't go on and off, or all of that was interesting to come up against.
Mara, what about you with Interview? Is there a specific challenge? Well, first of all, where it's set.
The reimagining of this show, Interview with the Vampire, takes place in 1910 to 1940 in New Orleans, which was the era of Storyland, which is a lot of people credit as the kind of birthplace of American jazz. So it was a real pleasure. It's an area of New Orleans, a neighborhood that doesn't exist anymore. It was completely leveled for a highway system. And so as someone who has lived in New Orleans over the last 20 years, it was a really exciting adventure to go down because we had to build it. We built a big backlot that was kind of selections of streets of Storyville, and it was a really exciting project. I think the thing that, as a designer that's done several period television shows, I think television is known for its rigorous pace and demands and not always having scripts. And I think that period television is this kind of formidable beast because you can't just walk into a space and shoot. If it's period, there's so many things that have to be adapted, and same with the wardrobe and you can't just go into a Gap and buy underwear from 1900. So there has to be so much planning that goes into making what often comes out to be about 4 feature films, because television series are so long. And if you're lucky, you have the scripts, but most often you don't. So it's a real pressure cooker. And but it, for me, I think the funnest part about it is getting to dive into the research and showcase things that people may not know about the time periods. And it's really a pleasure to work on period television.
Awesome. Yeah. Chris?
I'm Chris Eyre, and I directed Dark Winds, the TV series that premiered last night. So, thank you. That was exciting to see it with a crowd for the first time and hear the jokes, and hopefully in the right places. And if they weren't, it was fine as well.
You don't often get that experience, right?
What.
Yeah.
And we shot in part on the Navajo Nation. It's set in 1971, 50 years ago. And ironically, we found, and this was interesting in our research, and I knew this, but not a lot has changed in that 50 years. And I say ironically because there are places that don't have electricity and running water. And the inside of the hogans are somewhat the same traditionally, the traditional hogans as we portrayed in 1971. The cars are different. It's not like Cuba, where they fix up the car and it remains the same forever. But it is a little bit like that, not entirely. So there was like a Pontiac Catalina that my grandpa used to have, and I used to play in that car in the 70s. And I just remember that grill and those 2 lights. It was like the GTO almost, but bigger. And those kind of things are just really stimulate you to this place of just period beauty. And so it was kind of that mixture of this vast landscape, an abyss of desert, mesas and plains, and sparsely you'd put in this kind of period stuff, 8-track tapes. We had 8-track tapes, that kind of thing. And so it was very sparse, but not a lot had changed in terms of it being out there on the res somewhere.
Yeah.
So it was kind of ironic.
That's cool. Silas, you mentioned details, which obviously if this were a stage play, the audience is there, but because we live in a medium of, the camera can be anywhere, it's close up on a prop or a piece of the set or whatever. Was there, and anybody can chime in or everybody can chime in, was there a specific detail that you can remember? I mean, the underwear is a great example. That was really hard to get right. Can you remember like a specific thing that was like, we had a really big challenge on this one thing for one reason or the other?
Well, there definitely were challenges. Oh, shoot. There definitely were challenges. But one of the things that was just awesome to recreate was there's the Dickinson uses a lot of facts, even though it's an absurdist sort of presentation of it, and modern language, so it's hard to tell. But we recreated this queer bar that was in New York in the mid-1800s that Walt Whitman used to go to, and it was just amazing to like unearth these places that I had never heard about as a long time queer. And so that was just uncovering all these spaces or recreating them, the history. It felt really magical. And then we had to create the inferno in the Dickinson's house. That was a bit of a challenge. So we had these like never-ending stairs, really hard to make infinity stairs, just FYI, if you're planning on doing it. So there were a lot of, because we live in Emily's head so much in the show, there's a lot of going to these odd spaces. So that's the challenge and the fun of the show for sure. Yeah.
You guys remember anything very specific that was something that the collaboration between other, department heads, you kind of came together to find something?
Yeah, I think the exciting thing about vampires is all of the rules of vampires, and they want to be protected during the daytime for a variety of reasons. And so I think our showrunner Roland Jones has a very dry sense of humor, and there were these kind of built-in elements of the protection during the day in their home, and and hidden walls, things that you could access so that there would be secret coffin rooms and things like that. And so working with the special effects department, we're trying to make them as fun as possible. And I don't want to spoil too many of them because there are some great things, but we had, like I said, secret walls. There were panels that could open. There were secret ways to see if it was daylight outside. There was a lazy Susan built into the floor so that a wall could spin. And again, I think that on a TV schedule, sometimes when you read these things, you're like, you gotta be kidding me. Because it's not just building a 4-wall set, you now have to build a set that comes apart and not just for shooting, but also in camera, it has to move and manipulate. And I think that we had a really game special effects coordinator who I would come to him and I'd say, what if we did this? And he was like, well, all right, let's try it. So I think that those were challenges that were great. I think the thing we didn't anticipate was the nightmare of how heavy coffin lids are and how often vampires like to open them on camera. And that was a real nightmare. And I think if you named like the #1 problem of Interview with the Vampire, it's coffin lids. But again, we worked with the special effects department to figure out ways to get them to not kill our actors. And we had to have multiple versions of the coffins so that you could shoot inside of them and see what was happening in them. So something I didn't expect. Now I know I don't want to work with coffins again.
I'm not going to do a spoiler, so I won't say the word, but we were in a confined space underground with rock walls. But that was challenging. I mean, I'd never done that. That's not a practical. That was actually sets that were built, and it was really strange because you read the script and it would say he's in the passageway, he's in the garage. You're like, garage? Wait, this is and how's there a garage in it, like the bat thing? And it's like, so you're sitting there and you're trying to piece this together. And it was a new experience. You turn on a Zippo, he's walking around, he has a flashlight. You're like, wait, that wall looks like the Flintstones. It looks like that wall, And all of a sudden you go, wait, it doesn't really matter which way I'm shooting. It's a passageway, it's a hallway, it's a garage, it's a living room, whatever you want it to be. So it was kind of interesting because I had this concept of this whole, big space, because we park cars in it, there were passageways and all this, but it just turned out to be kind of, you could place whatever you wanted in that space, but there were certain points where the character has to look through cracks and POVs and drops rocks and shoots their gun and all that stuff. But I had this concept of how difficult it was going to be, and then there was below the floor level there was a little well. You remember Silence of the Lambs, where it puts the lotion in the basket. There was a family down there, and so it was interesting to shoot in. There was a lot of dust, and we were double masked, and it was horrible to shoot in.
Well, you brought up something interesting, which was you were describing there for a second, like what it actually said on the page versus like what the experience was shooting it or what it like turned into be. So maybe kind of speak to that. I mean, I know we had the pitch competition here yesterday. We have a lot of people, thinking about being writers or currently writing. I guess, again, for anybody, just chime in as part of the conversation, but what is kind of that experience been for you? And it not necessarily even have to be on this show, but just because we're talking about worlds in general and world building, what doesn't have to be a historical piece that happens on all TV shows. We have to have this process of creative collaboration and production designer and director and all that. So I guess just kind of speak to maybe like taking it from page to screen, kind of navigating that journey. And if there is something that was like very different maybe in a scene or a moment or a sequence that you remember, or maybe that you weren't quite sure how you were gonna do that, and then kind of what the end result ended up being.
Yeah, it's Yeah, thinking about the different periods of shows, there was another episode that was a time traveling, not hot tub, but it was a time traveling arbor, wherever, you sit down, there's flowers around it, can't remember the name of it. And then Emily Dickinson and her sister go to the 50s and they meet Sylvia Plath. So it was just interesting to look at the details of like that 1860s butting up against 1950s and using sound or sprinklers and all these things to like make these worlds come to life in ways that the camera will see and the actors will react to, and as economically as possible. It always drives me nuts how little gets seen with beautiful production design and on Transparent. Our production designer would do little things that she knew Jimmy Frono, the DP, would gravitate towards. It was like a little catnip for him, but
Yeah, exactly. Like,
but yeah,
we're gonna show off your pretty thing. Don't worry.
yeah. But it's but yeah. So it's thinking about that, and I heard this from one director that I worked with, which is you take that line of action that could be easily cut, and you make something out of it, make something that's really detailed, or make it uncuttable, uncut outable. And I think that's part of it as well. But yeah, the world building part of it is really all in these details.
And a lot of that is on the page, actually. Or
Well, I have to say, as a TV director who came from indie, I was like, well, what am I going to do as a director? There's so much to do, even with shows that I don't work on, repeatedly, because of all of those elements. People can't track it. They're doing the whole season, so your job is to babysit the episode and do as good of a job as you can. Because there is a lot. There's, your point of view is going to bring a lot to where you put the camera and how you work with the actors. So I think those are the added elements, and that's the fun part. Is there is room to expand and define things. Yeah.
Usually, I'm one of the first people that's hired on shows. The production designer starts very early with the locations team to start hashing out the strategy of what's built and what's the location, and the scripts are a good Bible of like your set list of what the things you're looking for are. But usually, when I am working on a period show, and you're fixed in one place, or maybe you have units in specific places, you start to strategize like where and how to do things, and if it doesn't exist, what has to be built. And when I'm working with the locations team, I usually say, okay, this is the concrete list of what's scripted, but now here's a reference package that I've given you of like what I've discovered in my research of things that were interesting from that time period. And like, you as this expert of this location hub, what things do you know of that aren't in the script, but that we could help pitch to give us more scope and scale in a show? And so I always have this secondary list of things of like, and I leave it open-ended, and I say, you tell me what's great here, and let's try to get to that. And I've been really fortunate to work with writers and showrunners who embrace that strategy to say, let's not fit a square peg into a round hole. Let's adapt and pivot. And I think those are the best production experiences, when you have a team of people who are just trying to get the most on screen, as opposed to fixating on something that isn't producible. And an example of this in a really big way was the show that I worked on before Interview was called Pachinko. And there was an episode 7, which was a departure episode, and it was about the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923. And it was a standalone, and it was like a huge, giant movie in and of itself, in that it was like 24 hours over the course of a massive earthquake in Yokohama. And so everything...
Easy?
So easy. Yeah. And we, it was like it was huge and great, crazy. And so... that was one that we just kind of like broke apart in pieces, and we had a director in DP that also said, you know what, instead of putting the onus all on Mara and me of building everything, let's change the aspect ratio and let's change the POV for this departure episode, because it's a different character, so that it's first person, so it's more experiential, and we can get lost in the smoke and things can happen. And so again, it's like, the amazing thing about the medium of film or television is that it's not a singular art form. You're not working alone. And the best projects usually come about when you have people who are all trying to kind of help each other get the best thing, lifted up the hill. when you have people that are kind of trapped in on the page, and that's not to say that that's wrong, but it does make it all the more challenging because you have to make an exacting thing, and this isn't an exacting art. So yeah.
Yeah, I just say that it's a marvel to me still, the things that I see people do in terms of production design and creativity and coming up with things and being able to, like you said, compartmentalize something so it's approachable. Sometimes I read something on the page, I go, what the, how are we gonna, that doesn't, I can't digest it. And so, you take it into chunks and you go, okay, I can figure that out, And you trust, Mark Garner was the production designer on Dark Winds, and he did a fabulous job. And, like I said with the cave, it's like, I just trust in the team also. So, I mean, when he opens that, that setup, or we start to talk about the set in practical terms by walking over to it, it's like, now this is here. Yes, that's here. Oh, and then this is here, even though the wall looks the same. This kind of thing where you're getting the minutia of it. Well, because, and you start to break it apart, which is really interesting. So I'm always fascinated by the application of your creatives and your keys, which you should trust. I mean, that's one of the things, is like, literally, it's not you that's like carrying the ball all the time. It's like, let me throw passes and let people catch and score. I mean, you have to step back and say, what was the intention? How does that work? And trust that team. So there were just a lot of those incidences where I'm always, just surprised and in love with the collaborators that we get to work with. And so we did a whole Main Street up in Espanola, New Mexico. And, he changed all the buildings and the awnings and the signage. And we had a hero one-screen theater, because it was the big, meal of the street. And, there wasn't a direction that I couldn't look, and it's just because he applied, his budget really resourcefully to knowing what we were doing. And then it's just always a marvel to me that, like, wow, this works really well.
Well, and to your point, you built an entire new city, and then I don't know, do you just tear it down? Like, after it's all over with, what happens to it? It gets taken apart?
I've been lucky to build a few backlots, and I did a show called The Alienist several years ago, and at the time we built the largest backlot in Europe in Budapest, and it was like a total of like 15 city blocks that were 6 or 7 stories high, and the show was supposed to run for 6 seasons, which it did not, but it was engineered for a 30-year build. So we actually put, we had basements in the street that you could go down into, and steel structure that went down into the ground. And it was an investment by the studio to build this like long-term thing. And it's funny because now I see it all the time in other television and movies, and I'm like, yeah, I did that a while ago. And so that was a really rewarding backlot to build. It was very, very difficult, but it was great. And then for Pachinko, we built the Ikuna Ward, which was a Korean neighborhood in Tokyo in the 1920s. And that again was like 20 meandering little blocks. And we built that in Vancouver. And that, because they don't know where the second season was going to be shot, we packed the whole thing up into a warehouse, and that is sitting somewhere waiting to be told where the second season's going to be. The backlot that we built for Interview, we built in New Orleans East in an old Home Depot parking lot. And because, again, like the urgency of television, it's so fast, a lot of the times the fortitude that we had on The Alienist to build for 35 years, you don't always have the luxury of that time to build the structure in. And so for Interview, it was built basically for the season. And as we all know, in New Orleans, we're coming up on hurricane season. AMC owns the rights to all of Anne Rice's canon, so they are actually in production right now on the Mayfair Witches. So they're scrambling to take advantage of much of that set as they can before hurricane season comes in and potentially takes it away. Actually, while we were filming, a tornado hit 2 blocks from our set, and our green screens blew over while we were all on the stage in New Orleans. It was pretty intense, but I think it really, it kind of hits home sometimes. You're like, my background is in architecture, and the fun thing about film and television is that you get to do these like really quick shreds. You know, you're constantly doing new designs and doing things, but times like that when you're like, oh right, these things could kill people. It does hit home how important it is to be aware of the impact of your big builds and what's happening.
I like that you brought up your background, because I was curious as you guys were talking. You know, obviously this panel, you guys are directors, you're production designer, but this panel just in general is kind of a world building concept, including props and costumes. What is your background, and how did you kind of get into directing for you two? And obviously we know architecture, but maybe give us a little more of that transition.
I have no architecture or I was in a punk band for 10 years. That did prepare me for filmmaking, most definitely. But I fall in love with stories that are often unique and take place in different times, and usually the past is present in the story, like whatever is happening there is still happening now. So I love the ability, even with Dickinson, to have a period show with humor and comedy, Jane Krakowski, and he's like, and those dresses are beautiful, but they're so corseted in, it's insane. But yeah, and then, so yeah, I just think it's, I'm really interested in worlds through different lenses, and certainly history through different lenses, because history is a bit of a problem.
Was there something that you saw in like as you were kind of coming up that was really like, that stayed with you, that you think about often or inspired you in some way?
No, I mean, movies did in general. Like a lot of those movies from the '70s too. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or Midnight Cowboy. But no, after I made my first feature, I was like, "Oh, I never want to do that again." That almost killed me. And but then I fell in love with this story about Billy Tipton. So he was a jazz musician through the '30s, '40s, and '50s. And then
music. Punk
music,
band,
exactly. And so I
there.
learned a lot about jazz. And he, when he died, it was discovered he'd been born female, but the jazz world and his sons that were adopted and his wife didn't know. And so, yeah, it got me to learn a lot. And music is connected. I think even just the rhythm of a scene, or in production design, the rhythm of certain columns, or it's so amazing to see what production designers do. Like on the movie I just finished, I was shooting we were doing a scene at a cafe, and I wanted to get my girlfriend some flowers, and I was like, oh my God, this most beautiful, it was like perfectly right there. I was gonna go buy a whole bunch of them. And I went, and I'm like, there's nobody there. And my assistant goes, and there's like little basket with eggs and like all this little farmer's market. And my assistant goes, I'm gonna blow your mind. And she throws an egg at me, and it's rubber. It's our production. I went to buy all flowers from our.
The ultimate compliment.
I was
you
like,
tried
I can
to
take them all. Yeah, it was ultimate. It was really amazing. So.
That's awesome. So what was that transition from architecture into production design for you?
So I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, and there is a really great youth theater company there called Mosaic Youth Theater of Detroit, and they have a technical theater department. And so they came to my school when I was like 9 years old, and I was like, that is so cool. And so at 11, I got into technical theater design and started, learning about light board operating and stage managing and set design. And just loved it. Thought theater was the funnest thing in the world, but didn't think my father is an engineer, and he was like, "That's not a real job." And so he was like, "If you want to get into design, think about architecture," which I did, and I got my master's degree in architecture. Worked as an architect for a little while, and was bored out of my mind. And Hurricane Katrina, actually, I was working in New Orleans, hit, and the firm I was working for was contracted by FEMA to do inspections. And so for months, we were going door to door, assessing houses and with their damage. And again, talking about depressing, that was an eye-opening experience just to see that much devastation. And I had made a documentary in college about architecture and how the American perspective on architecture and how it's impacted by home improvement reality television show. And a friend of a friend had seen it, and he randomly called me one day and said, "This is super weird, but do you want to art direct a movie?" And I was like, anything to get out of this. And it was about home assessment by insurance adjusters during hurricanes. So I just had all this experience doing that, essentially. And so I went thinking this is just going to be a summer project. Like, this will just be something I do to kind of tide me over so I can go back to architecture. And that was over 15 years ago. So, you know, everyone always asks, how do you get into film? And I think a lot of people just kind of trip into it. Yeah. And I think that, you know, when people ask, what should I go to school for to go into film? Honestly, the thing I always say is, go have life experience, because that life experience informs what you are able to contribute to a show. So whether you're in a punk band or whether you did a youth theater group, you know, whatever it is that you're doing, I know it's cliche, we're storytellers. This is what we do. You got to be able to tell a story, and you have to have lived to have done that.
And I would just add that I tripped my way into it after 20 years of working for free. Because I always hate to paint the picture of it happening, you know, you're like an overnight success 20 years later or whatever.
Right, yeah, exactly. Tell us about yourself.
I was inspired by a school event as well when I was young. The Harlem Globetrotters visited my school, and that didn't work out for me in basketball. But I did pick up a camera when I was in high school, and I started doing photography ad nauseum, and it's probably because I wasn't good socially, and it turned into this after, 30 years, or maybe I was in high school 40 years, I can't remember. But it's true, it's life experience, and I think along with what you were saying, I'm emotional, I'm an emotional person, and that either gets kind of squelted by, the world in terms of you go along to get along, or you remain fighting and telling the stories that you want to tell to get that out, to get that exercise out. And I think that's kind of what we do as storytellers and creators is, we've learned to channel our energy through the stories. And life experience is just such a big part of that. For me, I've always tried to put Native people on screen, Native American people on screen. And so that's just kind of my love. And that's like a lifelong pursuit where you're just saying, look, you don't understand. I need to tell you something. Yeah. And you say, wait, I got to tell you something, and you're constantly trying to push that ball, up the hill. And, it's never going to, thank God we have that, thank God we have something that we want to do. I see a lot of our times in society, and, it's a blessing to have something to push against, to fight against, to rail against, because that's what makes the world go round, And so for young filmmakers and stuff, I just say, there's that story that I think it was a Meryl Streep story, which is the actress comes up to her and says, I want to be an actress. What do you think? And she says, I don't think you should do it. And the girl goes, why not? And she says, because if you ask, you're never going to make it. You just have to do it. And I think we get here by happenstance. I mean, it wasn't my goal, and I'm surprised I'm sitting here today. It wasn't my goal. It just, you just keep connecting the dots and doing it in a good way, and things happen,
Yeah, I mean, the first film that I made was, I hadn't made a short, hadn't made anything, and people were like, maybe you should make a short first, and we're like, nah, we'll just make a feature. 3 years later, it almost killed us, but it's been, it was really a rewarding thing, and we didn't know all the rules, so we broke rules, or we learned them and broke them, and we did it because we had an urgent need to tell this story, and it wasn't out there, and it's a big still a motivating factor in all of my work, is to shift who's in the center of the story, and and the rules that they get to not have to follow, because there's a lot of rules for who's in the center of the story if they're not the usual suspects. So
It sounds like you guys, there's a following of curiosity, like, and it's just like, oh, I want to know more about this. This is interesting, and that leads to something else, and then it, opens up. Did you guys have anything? I know you kind of spoke to something that you had seen, but did you guys have anything, either film or television, that was like a big thing that stuck with you through your childhood or your formative creative years that you kind of always go back to, or that,
My mother was a public school teacher, and we were only allowed to get movies from our library, and they only had like 4. And Lady Hawk, Splash, Watership Down, and I don't remember what the last one was, but I definitely credit.
I thought you were joking with 4, but you really meant 4.
Oh no, and we watch them all the time. Like my sister and I know like every word to Lady Hawk. But I credit Lady Hawk to like why I do period now. Like I think that there's something just deep down, which is very strange that would be the movie that got me into it.
That's awesome. Yeah. What about you, Chris?
What was the question?
Just was there an actual piece of film or television from your childhood?
Yeah, I did study some film, and I just remember, John Ford and, Stagecoach and the horses going one way and then the other way. And everybody said, that's really stupid, because why didn't they just shoot the first horse and stop the stagecoach, And there were all those ironies when you got to movies with native people in them. But, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is incredible. Little Big Man, one of my favorites. So we put Little Big Man on the marquee in the first episode in 1971. But those were the things that really stuck with me, is just kind of those John Ford movies, and John Wayne was in those, and he was he was the guy. He was the American guy, And so we have some dig at him in the series now, where they talk about his, I hate to give it away, but they talk about his bowel movement, or, and, they make fun of him a little bit, but, he deserves it. It's fine, And so, there's that Western, and I was kind of thinking of the Western as we shot in the Southwest, and, you think of all those great movies. It's kind of interesting because, on one hand you have the errors of some movies, Birth of a Nation, but in my mind, and I can't speak for anybody else, I mean, they're a marker of the time and the reflection of the things that we're trying to correct. And so you can't just, push them out so people can't study what the consciousness of the time was for people. And so basically, things like Dances with Wolves is a great movie. And then every once in a while you go, that's kind of really surfacey, it's the leather and feather Indians, and, romanticizes, and everybody laughs about Mary McDonald, who had her hair all Wilma Flintstone, again, the Flintstones, and dirt all over her face. And all my Lakota friends were like, we would have treated our guests better than that. We would have wiped her off and combed her hair, and we wouldn't have let her just walk around the village like that. We're good people, And so, you have all these funny things in the movies, and it's just kind of one of those, you're influenced by the good and the bad, and, you kind of imitate some of them, and then some of them you flop over,
Yeah, that's an interesting thought, and that made me think of an additional question. And we'll end on this question, and I'll open it up. But with sort of like the world of social media now, and sort of like the opportunity, I guess, for people to kind of pick apart, particularly here talking about historical pieces, and pick apart the details and pick apart the accuracy and all of that stuff. Have you guys found any challenges with that, or that it's like informed certain decisions that you've made on set, like knowing that that's a possibility, or maybe just kind of speak to that?
I guess the main thing is, I'm trying to do authentic casting and build from the ground up something if you're doing any kind of new representation. Because, I've grown up watching films that didn't represent my life, and if they're a good story, I connected. So that math works every which way, you know. Anyone can connect to a good story that's told, you know, from the ground up. And so I think that's, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but those details of what's true or not, you know, I just think are important. And sometimes
secondary-ish to the actual emotional.
well, yeah, they're supporting it. Sometimes I even feel like it's spellcasting, you know, like I put a picture of a friend who had died from complications of HIV, and I put it was on transparent. I put her picture behind Tambor's head because I knew that wouldn't get cut. So, but you know, there's objects and props that people will bring in sometimes that build the world, and I think as real as you can make it, I think that's really important, and it's yeah. And again, I don't know if that answers the question.
No, it definitely did. I mean, what I'm hearing you saying is that, like, yes, those like super accuracies are important, but if the story's there,
Oh, yeah.
then it's
More emotional for me than the
Yeah.
accuracy. Although, you know, with Dickinson, they followed so many true things that the Dickinson experts were very happy, even though there was a lot of liberties, tons of liberties taken. But yeah, that's the only one I care about is sort of the emotional and character life representation. Yeah.
You know, every show is so different with the requirements, and I think a huge part of filmmaking right now has to do with clearance and legal aspects, which is like the bane of my existence. But I think, you know, I worked on another series called Mrs. America, which was about the women's movement in the 70s, and there was so much of what we were allowed to do. We were painstakingly recreating political conventions and different events that are documented on film, and part of us being able to recreate them was that we had to meticulously replicate what had been made, and or other times we couldn't depict them and had to completely depart from what they had. So you have to go through an entire process up front with script clearance and all sorts of things to kind of navigate what it is that you're allowed to show and what the confines of that are. And on Mrs. America, I think we had 12 graphic designers because we recreated 4 different political conventions: the tickets, the signage, the banners, the brochures, the packets that were sent out in advance of that, the stamps that were sent out in advance. All of those things had to be made. And even though they're only on screen, sometimes they're not even on screen, but for a fleeting second, that type of world building for me as an audience member is what really draws me into things. And it also makes me want to investigate things further, but it also creates a world for the directors and the actors that's so immersive that, you know, I'd like to think that it helps cultivate better performances and things like that when you're able to really inhabit a period space in a way that has all those textures and details. You know, we joked that it's the it's the Sex and the City that we all really wanted, and that you had, you know, Betty Friedan, and you had all these like amazing women that you actually want to aspire to, not just who you think you would have sex with, and so for us, you know, in the art department, it was like, how do we flesh out their home environments in a way that really show who they are as individuals? And so, you know, there were some characters that we knew a ton about, and we had photos of their homes, and there were others that we had nothing but kind of written narratives of experiences that people had in their spaces. And so really spending a lot of time fleshing those things out and making that happen.
what's the length of time, the lead time that you usually get with something like that?
It varies. On some shows, you know, for television, on average, I'm usually on anywhere from 3 months to 6 months to sometimes 7 or 8 months before we actually start shooting. And usually I'm on before the art department fully starts. So I usually have a month of just like locking myself in a room and like becoming an expert on all weird things of that time period. So that if I don't have that period of gestation of really sinking things in, the rigor and pace of television is so extreme. There's no time to stop and go back and look things up. Like if I don't know the answer, we're gonna make it up. And like, you know, you have to kind of always be on top of it so that and it's the same, in a tenfold for directors, where you're in the moment, you have to have an answer, you have to know, and you have to be confident in that, because you have hundreds of people waiting to execute those things.
Chris, you're nodding vigorously. I guess like speak to that a little bit, like when you're there, when the cameras are set up and the actors are there, and maybe something isn't right or there's a question or whatever. Like, how do you navigate those moments?
That's some of the worst feeling, I can tell you, when the clock's ticking and you're like, wait a minute, everybody stop. Just stop. Everybody stop. Let me think about this. And it rarely happens, but it is a consideration sometimes that you don't let the whole thing just keep spinning. It has to have direction. And authenticity is really important. I remember one incident where I was shooting and there was a Native American gentleman and another one debating one another, and it turned into yelling. And I had a cultural consultant come to me and say, we would never do that out of respect and deference for, the conversation. And I said, okay. And then I said, stop. And I recalled drama, which is, these guys were fighting about blood law, meaning they would kill one another for their belief system. If somebody turned against the tribe, they had the right to kill, that person in traditional culture. And I said, I don't know if I buy that, because if these guys are debating, their blood law, I think they might talk over each other, in this instance. And so, you have to stop and go, wait a minute, there's best practices, but then you also have to look at it as a creative and say, what is my intuition in this? And I ended up letting them step on each other, and went, past what the consultant was advising, because he may have been romanticizing, for all I know. And there was another instance where there was a piece of music that was given to me as a consideration for the film, and it was sung by a gentleman. And we wanted to use it, and I said, I don't think we can use that. And the attorneys said, yeah, well, I think it's okay. And I said, I don't think we can use that, because there aren't intellectual property. There's not copyright for intellectual property. Like, this is a song that is not written down, but it is a community's song. How do you account for that in legal terms? Right. So I said, that is not his right to assign that song to us. It's not his property. Just because it hasn't been copywritten doesn't mean that it's his. It hasn't been copywritten because people don't want it copywritten. So we can't ascribe that to him and then buy it from him and say it's his. It's a community song. So I went to the attorneys and I said, I don't think we can use that, and had to explain that. So, there's best practices, but there's also you as a producer and director and production designer and artist, and you have to go, wait a minute, let me just think this through a little bit. And the thing is about Native culture, it's a living culture. So just because somebody says this is the way it was, doesn't mean that's the way it should be. If you think it's a living culture, you go, wait a minute, I can change that too, if I can own the story. And that's our job, is to own the story. And so, you can contribute to it. And I think as you get older, you understand, like, okay, this is best practice, but I'm controlling the story here.
Just having those thoughtful conversations and coming to a collective decision about it.
On pose too, a lot of the, the historical representation of the culture has been through Madonna, appropriating it. And so, there's a lot of really distinctive moves and ways of walking a category in the late 80s and early 90s when the show was taking place. And so there was a lot of conversations and a lot of icons and legends that were in when we did the balls, they were all people from ballroom. So it was just like a party, like a crazy party. And so it was all this intergenerational conversation. But yeah, the history is not really recorded in the way that we have all the other history recorded. So a lot of times when I was producing, directing, directors would come in and I would have them meet with Michael or Twiggy, one of our consultants, and go through and watch these really amazing YouTube clips of walking category and sort of really see it in play. And Michael teaches that. He teaches Vogology, and so he had but it's all just little bits and pieces here. So you got, yeah, it's very,
Little windows, but not like
yeah,
the full picture.
yeah, exactly. It's a much more oral history as well.
Well, we have time for a question or two from you guys. Oh, first hand went up there. Yes. Yes.
Fan of all of your guys' work. I'm not sure if any of you were involved in the pitching process of the shows, but I accidentally wrote 3 shows that are different period pieces. And as anyone can tell you, period shows are like the hardest thing to sell. So my question to you is, what can we use as writers, like going into the pitch, if we've thought about this? We know you're going to say we're not period, but we've thought about this. Like, what's something that we can use as like put in our tool belt to kind of get ahead of that question?
Period shows are usually bigger shows too, which is a consideration.
Yeah.
The only thing I would say is knowing specifically what the world is so that you can control, like the project that I had about Billy Tipton, it was Oklahoma, it was smaller clubs, it wasn't, Cotton Club and Harlem. So I think just how you're seeing the world, is there anything anachronistic, or, just knowing those details so that it's not, just an entire, I guess it is crazy when you go and shoot anything, period, you got all the cars and then all the, added visual effects. It's a lot of work. So yeah, so I guess thinking about the scope would be one thing.
Yeah, I think so. I think, like a show like The Alienist, for example, that was attempted to be made for over 35 years before they finally made it. And it went millions of dollars over budget and all sorts of things. And I think that, there's a difference between writing a show like The Alienist, which is about New York streets at the turn of the century, that's huge and epic, and every other scene is an exterior that doesn't exist anymore, versus a quiet, reflective period piece that's mostly interior. And so I think it's like knowing what your budget realm is and being very aware that every new set is going to cost money. Like there's no benefit of you're in, Albuquerque and you're going to get to take advantage of this other thing. Like anybody that has to walk in there is going to have it'll have to be manipulated for a period. And so just being very conscientious of how many sets there are, how many people there are in every scene, it's the same for wardrobe, every single costume for background usually has to be created. It's not just your hero characters. So it's aware that for period, your costs are exponential, and knowing, if you're gonna write a very specific period piece that's about an event or a place, an idea of where and how you're going to do that, so that there's a production strategy in place instead of kind of throwing it on the creative team to figure out how to do that is always a challenge as well.
This will be our final question. And if anybody else has a question, I don't know if you guys can stick around in the lobby for just a second, but yes.
You touched on a lot of challenges of doing period pieces, and I'm wondering, is there something specifically that you think is the biggest challenge, or does it change between shows or films? What do you think would be the biggest challenge in creating period pieces?
There's a few. Trying to think of, but then that's also the richness of, just the fabrics and wallpaper. Everything is just so much more interesting in certain eras, like certain cultures. But yeah, I'd have to think about it. Definitely the wardrobe for Dickinson was, I think a lot for the actors to when it was summertime and they're wearing petticoats and the corsets. But I have to think about it to be more specific. If I really want to go. Oh, I forgot to talk in the mic. I don't know if you could hear me at all. Okay. Oh, sorry about that.
Oh, I didn't even know.
I know.
In terms of challenges, I think my problem, after I finish every period TV show, I'm like, I'm never doing that again. It's really, really hard. And my husband is like, you listen to yourself right now. And then 3 months later, someone's like, there's this amazing story. And the problem is, a lot of the times the studio or producers, you'll get to a point in every show, you get the scripts, they're wonderful, they're exciting, you want to make it, it's great, do the research, fun. And then you get to the point where you start budgeting and the reality of what the show is capable of versus what its ambitions are come home. And a lot of times on period shows, the art department is one of the largest budgets because there's a lot of set building, there's things you have to do. And so most of the time they come straight to our office and they say, help, what do we do? And I think honestly, one of the biggest challenges is like killing your babies. You know, it's like you've spent months creatively figuring out how to solve this problem, and now you have to kill a few of them or consolidate a few of them. And you have to kind of like just separate yourself from that creative process and say, the best thing for the show is to purge these things, or that second list that I was talking about before of like locations or assets that exist that haven't been written to, you know, like, oh, but we have this thing, you know, maybe it's not this, but maybe you can do this instead, and you're still going to get scope for the show. And I think for me, the biggest challenge is always that phase of production where for so long I can imagine what this show is. I see it, I've designed it, I know it, and then you have to smother it and like get it in. And that's not to say that a lot of times that's going to make the show better, because we all are going to benefit from that editing process and like purging out things. Because if you do a whole lot of stuff in a desaturated way, it's probably not all going to be good. But if you can boil it down to the really important things and make those exceptional and like work together to figure out what those are, that's when the good stuff comes out.
All right, well, that's time, but thank these three fascinating panelists for their wealth of knowledge.